Welcome to Talkin Science, where we dive into the stories making headlines in the world of science and space. I'm Matt Miller. Dr. Brad Sacker is here. Brad, happy Tuesday.
How's it going?
It's the 33rd week of 2021. SpaceX is planning on sending a billboard into space, but not to hit us with ads. Perseverance came up empty in its first attempt to collect a Martian sample. And NASA's facing the very real problem of their next-gen spacesuits failing to be ready for Artemis in 2024.
This is Trekzone's Talkin Science. And you can get exclusive behind-the-scenes info and first-play access to all Trekzone podcasts by becoming a member today. Click join on every Trekzone video on YouTube. Go to the trek.zone/support or scan the QR code on screen throughout the show. Now, it's back to you, Matt.
Well, thank you very much, Ross. And don't forget our socials. Find Trekzone on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and your favourite podcast feed. Like, follow, and subscribe to help us convince the algorithm we're worth promoting. Of course, Brad, too, on social media, at btucker22 on Twitter. Brad, there is always something to look up at in the night sky. Last week it was the moon and Venus. This week, the moon, Jupiter, and Saturn.
Yeah, this weekend will be kind of a great show for it. Jupiter, the moon, and Saturn kind of all coming together. This aligns with Jupiter being at opposition on the 20th. So what you'll see is on the 20th, you'll see the moon, Jupiter, and Saturn, or Saturn, Jupiter rather, looking upward or looking towards the east. And then on the 21st, the moon will be between Jupiter and Saturn. And on the 22nd, it'll be right next to Jupiter. And it's visible just best after sunset, but it is visible all evening until the early morning hours. So it's kind of a great weekend to look up. And it's free, and you can do it from wherever you are. So it is the best activity that a lot of people can do right now.
Absolutely. And I heard Professor Lisa Harvey-Smith on ABC Radio. With all the lockdowns going on around Australia, you may not be able to travel 5 kilometres from your home on Earth, but you can travel billions of kilometres by looking up at the night sky.
That's exactly right. You can see wherever you want, assuming there's not clouds. Well, I can't do anything about that. I just shake my fist.
Exactly right. Well, let's get on with the show. First up in our headlines, Starliner is now on an indefinite hold after the 2 failed launch attempts we discussed over the last few weeks.
We did, and it was kind of waiting to see exactly what they were going to do or decide with this failure. There's really no other way of saying it, unfortunately. With their valves, they tried to fix it, as we talked about, at the launch pad. It didn't work. They gave it a few more days, still didn't work. And so now they're on indefinite hold. The capsule's making its way back to the facility to be rechecked and engineered. And they may not even get a launch in 2021. It may actually have to be until 2022, because once they fix it, they then have to schedule the launch and restart things. So another disappointment for Boeing, unfortunately, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, our friends at Southern Launch have issued their environmental impact statement for the upcoming Whalers Wayside, including a note that a bird who is facing other threats is living in the area, including on site. It brings home these complexities, Brad, and what can they do about them?
Look, and this is the sort of thing that you want to see with a company, especially in a place like Australia, is doing their due diligence for setting up a launch site like this. And so there's a lot of work that you can do in terms of conservation, preservation, potential, where you're looking at orientation. They're not just going to go bulldoze the place, which is good. So it's nice to see that they're taking this effort of doing the impact statements, not just with the traditional owners in the Eyre Peninsula, the Eyre Peninsula, sorry, but also the environment and those connections as well. So, it's one of those things. I think sometimes people wonder, you just decide I'm going to launch rockets and you set it up. Well, it takes a little bit more nuance than, and it's good to see them taking the time to do these nuances.
Absolutely. Well, it seems there's no escaping advertising these days, Brad. And now SpaceX has been contracted to launch a billboard into space, but their client, startup Geometric Energy, says it's only a Cubesat.
It is only a CubeSat, and look, there's a lot of interesting points to this story. And when we talk about CubeSats, we're talking about these small satellites about the size of a loaf of bread. They can be anywhere from 10 centimeters, so we call them cubes because they're 10 by 10 by 10 centimeter cubes that you can put together. You can configure them up to like 60 centimeters and all sorts of things. And this is where a lot of satellites now are being built in these small satellite payloads. Their vision isn't necessarily a giant billboard beaming to Earth, but rather a satellite that can essentially display messages and with a selfie stick take an image of that image, but with the Earth and space in the background. So instead of superimposing your logo on the Earth or in space or CGI, you could just take it as a real image in space.
It is a really cool concept with punters able to buy time on the satellite to get their message across as well. So it's not just these guys doing a YouTube or a Twitch stream. It is, I guess, the business model of things. You never know, Brad, if the price is right, we might just have to get Talkin Science up there as well.
Well, yeah, look, it's an interesting model what they're going to do, and I think they're obviously how they control who may buy time or purchase time. Let's just say the first profanity-laced message probably won't take that long. I'm sure someone will find a way of manipulating the system. In fact, that was one of the worries of the company. So they'll clearly have to do some regulation. How that's going to be clear and how they're going to do it remains to be a bit unclear. And you're not going to get, obviously, this high-res image, but it's just enough to have your image or whatever you're displaying with the Earth or space, depending on the orientation in the background. So it's an interesting idea, but it is a slippery slope when we talk about advertisements and billboards in space.
And it's an interesting one as well because there are some regulations that prohibit advertising in space.
Yeah, we talk a lot about space law and some of the gaps and some of the areas that are needing to be worked on. This is one of the few areas early on in the development of space law and treaties and regulation that actually was dealt with. People have known commercialization happens anytime, anywhere, any place. So they built that into it. So it's not actually that easy to go put up a billboard in space. Let's forget the technical issues that we require. If you want to put a billboard at 400 kilometers low Earth orbit, where most of the satellites are, to get the resolution you need to see the detail of a logo at that height, you're talking about a gigantic payload there. So it's not that simple. But nonetheless to say, people still worried about it. Where there's money, people will find a way. And so regulations do prevent essentially that advertisement and commercialization of altering the night sky for commercial profiteering, essentially. But this is not covered by this because they're not altering the view of Earth. They're just putting up another satellite, a small one at that. And it just so happens the other side has an empty display. So it's no different than people taking a photo of their satellite on board in space. That is done quite regularly for lots of valid reasons. So this clearly fits in within the law and regulation. I think what people are worried about is the slippery slope that this can present.
Well, what do you make of it all, Brad? We've talked about CubeSats like Starlink cluttering the night sky. Is there going to be any light pollution from this? Is this sort of, as you say, this slippery slope? Are we heading down plenty of CubeSats doing this sort of thing in orbit? Or is it all just a bit of fun, a bit of a proof of concept at this point?
So, CubeSats are artificial, and CubeSats generally aren't the problem other than the volume and the regulation and preparation for launch. One of the biggest problems we have with CubeSats is people don't take the time for testing and preparation to make sure it works in space. So a lot of CubeSats end up failing higher than other types of satellites because they don't do all those due checks. Now, what we do, quite literally where I work at Mount Stromlo, is test all of the CubeSats and satellites that Australia and New Zealand launches to prepare for space. And we have a really good success rate at actually having operational satellites. So you can solve that problem. Then their issue is the volume, and I think that's an issue regardless of what you're doing, is an issue of that we have to monitor of putting too many things in space, both for collisions and also obviously altering the nighttime sky. Where I see some of the issues, like we see with everything else, is that the law is clear and unclear in a lot of ways. It says one thing, but it is being up with the rapid pace of technology. A few years ago, there was a company that built this kind of disc disco ball thing in space where as it would spin, it would shine lights and you would see it. And people talked about these flashing light things so people can look, blow up and see it. And all of this is, it's one of these things where people aren't necessarily intending to do the wrong thing. They're not setting up to saying, oh, I'm going to go destroy the nighttime sky. They just don't necessarily think about all of the consequences and all of the parties involved in these decisions. And this is where I think the UN and a lot of discussions are happening and need to happen faster to get better regulatory bodies that represent all of these different views. How does it alter the cultural aspect of the sky, the environmental aspect of the sky, just the technology, to make sure that the law and regulations are clear in what it allows and clear in what it doesn't allow, so that we don't have things fall through the cracks. Because today's space selfie stick billboard may be a giant logo in space that can just enough get away with the law that isn't breaking the law, but we kind of know shouldn't be done. So, look, the technology is definitely pressing what we can do, but a lot of people are saying, we shouldn't just dump on it, but find better ways of making sure everyone's interests are preserved and listened to.
All right, well, next up, Perseverance missed the mark on its first attempt at scooping up some of the red planet.
Yeah, this is, obviously one of the big goals of Perseverance is to collect samples from Mars, analyze them on board, store them on board for a future return to the Earth mission. However, when they were doing their drilling for their first go, what they found was that essentially they drilled down and they got nothing. So when they drilled down this tube, they essentially just drilled down and saw a borehole of sand, but they weren't able to collect anything. So it's kind of like instead of drilling into rock, they ended up drilling into sand, weren't able to actually find or excavate rocks, and came up empty on their first go. So I think that the nearly 100 scientists who were eagerly waiting for this first venture were a bit disappointed in how it all played out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you said, all signs were positive until the weight of the sample container came through. 2 days of examining data showed that, as you say, they drilled into sand. Unfortunately, the rock didn't play ball that they thought it would, and now they have to go off and find something else to drill into.
And look, it's disappointment, but it's not necessarily unexpected. They know they always planned on multiple samples. They always wanted multiple areas. And it's still interesting the fact that they drilled down, they were able to take measurements of what they did. They didn't collect the rock, but they were able to see the type of soil and sand that they've never seen before. Because obviously they're trying to find places where there was water and maybe signs of life. And I think, they kind of concluded, well, they kind of saw the beach or sediment of what used to be Mars. That's not a bad discovery. It's just not the discovery they wanted. And this is why they do it, because it actually is hard. It's one thing to study and understand the type of rock, and whether it's sedimentary or something like that. What is the composition from images? It's another to drill down and sample with it. So luckily, they have Perseverance Ingenuity rather to help Perseverance. That drone is still scouring areas for it to find. So luckily, they have some eyes in the sky to aid them in their next venture.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, it was the first time the autonomous sequence of the sampling system was executed, and it did so flawlessly. Like I said, it's the rock that didn't cooperate, but it's not mission failure, Brad. The rover will head off to another location, try again. Hopefully, the helicopter will come up with something for them to sink their teeth into, quite literally.
Well, because he said it did work, it just didn't work. That's a weird thing to say, but it's true. And so that's not bad. As he said, everything worked well. That's what they wanted. And if we compare to something we've talked about before, NASA InSight, where the drilling of the rod to take the temperature did not work because they hit too hard of rock. It's really just goes showing the Martian landscape is varied. It's not unexpected. These things happen. That's why you build up redundancies. That's why you build up plans. That's why you build up prolonged mission lifetimes to be able to go and find it. And as you said, with Ingenuity there, it will save them some time in the investigations of best places to look. So here's hoping that the second time not only works, but they actually scoop up some rock.
Yeah, absolutely. Lastly, this week, Brad, NASA's new spacesuits have hit a snag and likely won't be ready for Artemis's landing on the moon in just 2 short years.
Yeah, look, this is a bit of a disappointment to a lot of people. The Inspector General of NASA was reviewing the progress, the performance, the budget of the next generation spacesuits for the moon, and they're coming up empty. They are coming up behind, over budget, and they see no way of it being ready for a 2024 landing on the moon. So, even ignoring anything else that could happen, the spacesuits wouldn't be ready, meaning that there's no way safely, or really at all, I guess, unless they use something else, of NASA astronauts landing in the moon by 2024. Likely, they estimate no earlier than April 2025, which means probably 2025, maybe even 2026.
And we're talking $1 billion on the development of these suits before two of them are even ready. There's a bit of money involved here, Brad, but even more value is protecting the crew who will inhabit them. I guess it's a matter of getting it right instead of getting it done for an arbitrary deadline.
And look, and this is true. We have to. People are wondering, well, hey, why are they spending this money and doing this anyways? They already have spacesuits. Well, there's already flaws in the current spacesuits. They're old. The designs aren't as effective. They're designed for low Earth orbit, not the moon, so different environments. The previous suits that they used in the Apollo era of the moon also weren't the best, knowing what we now know about the environmental conditions and the usability. Currently, spacesuits are kind of this one of three sizes fits all, small, medium, and large. They're hard to maneuver in. Something that people don't really realize is that a lot of these suits weigh so much because of all the gear and padding and insulation that they have. Now, in a microgravity environment, not as big of a deal. Anywhere when you start to become gravity, keeping in mind the gravity of the moon is about a sixth that of the Earth. We think of it as zero, but it's not. It's about a sixth. So when a suit weighs 200 kilograms, it still weighs pretty heavy, and that's still a big, bulky thing to move. Astronauts actually have a high rate of shoulder reconstruction surgeries, something that isn't realized because these things are so hard to maneuver in, and the pools that they simulate, they tear their shoulders. So these whole new spacesuits were designed to be safer, more effective, better fitting, more maneuverable. So, a much needed upgrade. And as you said, safety and functionality is key here. It's just not meeting this deadline that they wanted to meet. So a disappointment, but not a failure, because this is the process they should be doing, making sure it works, checking it, taking their time and not rushing it.
Absolutely. Now, development started in 2007, and there was a 1 year buffer built into the development, but that's been eaten up by the pandemic, funding shortfalls, and other technical challenges. What should they do, Brad? I guess delay the mission or go with the old suits?
So, and I mean, you raise a fair point, right? There has been a pandemic in this that everyone's contingencies have just been swallowed up by. We saw with the Rosalind Franklin rover, the Mars rover from Europe and Russia, that was delayed because of the pandemic, and they missed their launch window. This is a real thing that is happening to our world. I don't think anyone's going to ignore that. Some people pointed out because the way the contract suits are made, it's a conglomeration of contracts and contractors bidding and working on different parts coming together. Some people said maybe it would have been better if one group came together to build it all as one. Maybe that could be too late. Maybe someone can come in and save the day. Who knows? I think ultimately, because there's other delays, and the space launch system has been a little bit delayed. The Orion capsule is a little bit delayed. Not too bad though. The Orion capsule is one of the better things on track. That we're forgetting that all of these budgets and the planning started when they were aiming for 2028. And then that timeline got moved up to 2024. It did come up with some money and a big push, and they were trying to reach a deadline 4 years earlier, in addition to not realizing there'd be a year wiped off because of the pandemic. So it's not as necessarily bad as I think some people are making it out to be when you talk about when the development started and where they're at. So I think it's just part of the reality. They'll still get there, and it looks like Artemis 1 won't happen until next year anyways because of the rocket. So humans weren't planning to go on until Artemis 3 to land on the moon. So look, all of the timings kind of fit. It's just a disappointment that it's just yet another thing falling behind.
I think the other thing you could look at it too is when they came up with these plans in 2007, like you say, the intention was to travel in 2028. So the fact that it could be April 2025 or even the end of 2025, they're still ahead of schedule and they're going to get it done.
They are still ahead of schedule. That's right. And people say, "Oh, well, that's 15 years to develop it, or 20 years to develop it. Isn't that plenty of time?" It's hard. It takes time, and yes, it could be slow, but this is the process that you build into in the development. You do a lot of development and research before you just kind of lump into it. And as we've talked about before in lots of cases, space flight is very different from launching cargo to launching humans. There is a higher level of scrutiny, safety, checks, and regulation that is going into when humans are going up versus a satellite. And that's rightfully so. And if this was just, hey, we're going to go send up a robot to the moon, that's a very different game to we're going to go send up humans and they need to be safe and survive the lunar conditions. So, again, disappointment, but not dramatically unexpected. And yeah, as we're still seeing the effects of COVID on impacts of industry, not just here in Australia, but in the US. So it's not just solved all overnight that, everything has gone back to normal. And this is the world that we live in. And so they're finding ways of dealing with it as well.
Absolutely. Well, just before we go, Brad, a look ahead to this week's Talkin' Science interview. And speaking of Artemis, Professor James McNay is beaming in to explain his new ground-penetrating radar concept that shrinks the instrument's size down to a backpack, perfect for the Moon and Mars missions. Now, Professor, can you tell us about this mini radar? It sounds very cool. And MapRad is just a tenth the size of existing ground-penetrating radar systems, yet it's twice as powerful.
Well, it sees twice as close to almost twice as deep. I'm a scientist. I like to be exact. Yes, it was the mining industry have a sort of consortium called Amira, and they came to me. They wanted to put radar on unmanned aircraft, and the deep penetrating radars they used had antennas that were the size about 10 meters, even 5 to 10 meters. And that's just too big to fit on a typical unmanned aircraft that you buy at JCar or wherever you buy or more expensive ones. So with Canadian partner, we looked at ways of making radar smaller, and making the antenna smaller was the key thing that had to be done, which you can't do with electric antennas, but you can do with magnetic ones. So we decided to make a small magnetic antenna, and much to our surprise, we got it to work, and it was better than the existing ones.
And that interview will be out Thursday at 12:30 p.m. at GMT. If you're watching us in the future, click the card in the top right of the video. Members also have first play access to that right now. Follow the links to our website at trekzone.org as well, where you'll also be able to catch it. Brad, great to pick apart the stories of the week with you. We'll do it again next week.
Thanks.